Now, look, I want you to sit with me for a few minutes because something is happening in American politics right now that most folks haven't fully absorbed yet. And I think it matters not just for the next election, but for the kind of country we're going to leave behind. On the morning of March 22nd, 2026, a Sunday morning, mind you, when most Americans are at church or having breakfast with their families, the President of the United States sat down and wrote one of the most extraordinary public statements I have seen from any occupant of that office. And I have seen a great deal. In a single post on Truth Social, President Trump attacked Governor Gavin Newsom as a total racist, suffering from what he called mental incapacity. He went after James Talarico, the young Democratic nominee for U.S. Senate in Texas, calling him an insult to Jesus. He dismissed Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett as low IQ. He threw in veganism, mass curing, and gender identity as if they were criminal charges. And then almost as an afterthought, he declared, "Kamala is back." Now, a lot of people will look at that and say, well, that's just Trump being Trump. And I understand that instinct. We have all grown accustomed to a certain kind of noise from this president. But let me tell you something, and we'll come back to this in a moment. When a sitting president of the United States starts swinging at that many people in that many directions all at once on a quiet Sunday morning, that is not a display of strength. That is a man who sees something coming, something he cannot control with insults alone. And what's coming, I believe, is a shift that most people don't fully realize yet. The ground is moving underneath our politics. You can feel it in the special election results. You can see it in the approval numbers. You can hear it in the desperation of that post. Something is shifting. And before this conversation is over, I think you'll understand exactly what it is. Let me tell you where we are right now, because the context here is everything. You cannot understand why the president wrote what he wrote on that Sunday morning unless you understand the political landscape he woke up to. Since Donald Trump began his second term, Democrats have flipped 28 state legislative seats across red and battleground states. 28. Politico reported that on March 12th, and let me tell you, that number sent a shockwave through Republican circles that most Americans never heard about. In February, a Democrat won a deep red Texas state Senate seat by double digits in a special election in Texas. That is not supposed to happen, and everybody in politics knows it. Then you've got James Talarico, a 36-year-old state representative from Austin who won the Democratic primary for U.S. Senate, defeating Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. He's young, he's sharp, and he's running in a state where Democrats haven't won a Senate race in a generation. But suddenly, it doesn't feel impossible anymore. And then there's Gavin Newsom. Politico called him the 2028 Democratic frontrunner back in November of 2025. The Atlantic confirmed it in January. He's building a national profile through his book tour, his media presence, and his willingness to stand toe-to-toe with this White House. Now, here's the honest truth. While all of this is happening on the Democratic side, the president's approval rating has fallen to a net negative 21 in the Economist YouGov poll from early March. That is a record low for his second term. He is underwater in every single swing state. So when you read that Truth Social post, the insults, the name-calling, the desperate attempt to disqualify 3 different Democrats in one breath, you have to understand what's behind it. This is a president watching the political ground shift beneath his feet in real time. And we've got to remember, desperate politics rarely produces good governments. Now let's look at what he actually said, because the details matter more than you might think. Now let's slow down and look at what the president actually wrote, because I learned a long time ago that in politics, the specific words matter sometimes more than the intent behind them. He started with James Talarico calling him a fraud and listing his offenses. And what were they? He's got 6 genders, insults to Jesus, only vegan food, was wearing a mask in 2023 and 2024. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment. The President of the United States is listing veganism and mass curing as disqualifying characteristics for public office. He then claimed Republicans allowed Talarico to win the primary over Jasmine Crockett, who he called a low IQ candidate, while adding in parentheses no relation to Davy Crockett. That's the president's humor, I suppose. Then came the attack on Newsom. He called him newscom, which is what he does. He brands people and declared that Gavin suffers from mental incapacity, is unable to read a speech, and is dumb. Now, what's he actually referring to? In February, Newsom spoke to a predominantly black audience in Atlanta during his book tour and mentioned his low SAT scores and struggles with dyslexia, trying to relate to the crowd. Was it clumsy? I'll be honest with you, it was not his best moment. But Trump twisted that into calling Newsom a total racist in the eyes of African Americans and then declared it takes him out of the race. And then the strangest line of all, Kamala is back, as if he's trying to rearrange the entire 2028 Democratic field from his phone on a Sunday morning. Here's what I need you to see. When you lay these words out carefully, line by line, what you find is not policy. It is not governance. It is not even coherent strategy. What you find is a man reaching for every weapon on the shelf: race, religion, disability, food choices, masks, and throwing them all at once, hoping something sticks. And that tells you more about his position than any poll ever could. Now, let me tell you something from personal experience, because I held that office for 8 years, and not a single day went by when I didn't feel the weight of every word I spoke in public. When you're president, you learn very quickly that your voice is not your own anymore. It belongs to the country. Every statement you make, every phrase, every adjective ripples outward through the culture, through the media, through schoolrooms where children are watching and learning what leadership looks like. I made my share of mistakes in that office, Lord knows. But I understood even on my worst day that the presidency is a stewardship, not a weapon. What President Trump did in that Sunday Morning Post is use the most powerful platform on earth to mock a man's veganism, ridicule mass curing during a pandemic, call a black congresswoman low IQ, and label a sitting governor mentally incapacitated when what he's actually referring to is Gavin Newsom's lifelong struggle with dyslexia. That is not strength. That is not even politics. That is cruelty dressed up as commentary. I worked across the aisle with people I disagreed with profoundly: N. Gingrich, Trent Lott, Bob Dole. We fought like hell over policy, but there were lines we understood. You don't mock someone's disability. You don't use racial coding against a colleague. You don't weaponize someone's faith. And here is what I want you to understand. A president sets the tone. When Trump calls James Talarico an insult to Jesus, he is giving permission to every local official, every school board member, every internet troll to use religion as a bludgeon against anyone they disagree with. That is not governance. That is the unraveling of the norms that make governance possible. Now, here's where things start to get complicated, because this isn't just reckless, it's calculated. Let me be direct with you, because I think this moment requires directness. What happens to a democracy when the President of the United States selectively uses the phrase low IQ against black public figures? What happens when he mocks a learning disability, dyslexia, by calling a governor mentally incapacitated? What happens when he called the young man's faith an insult to Jesus because that young man happens to be a Democrat who talks about feeding the hungry and welcoming the stranger? I'll tell you what happens. It poisons the well. It makes every future political conversation a little bit uglier, a little bit meaner, a little bit harder to have in good faith. And that is exactly the point. Because when democratic discourse breaks down, when nobody trusts anybody, when every debate becomes a culture war, the people who benefit are the ones who don't want to be held accountable for anything. Now, I want to say something about James Talarico's response, because it matters. When the president called him an insult to Jesus, Talarico didn't fire off a press release. He stood in a church, a black church in Texas, and he delivered a sermon. He talked about what actually insults Jesus: indifference to suffering, cruelty toward the vulnerable, the worship of power over people. That is moral clarity. That is the kind of response that strengthens democratic institutions instead of degrading them. And I need you to pay attention to one more thing. When Trump wrote that Republicans allowed Talarico to win his primary, think about what that means. Either the president is lying, claiming a strategic control he never had, or he's revealing a conception of presidential power in which he believes he gets to decide who wins Democratic primaries. Either way, that language undermines public trust in the electoral process itself. And we've got to remember, once people stop believing their vote matters, democracy doesn't just weaken, it collapses. Now look, let's talk strategy for a moment, because underneath all the noise and the name calling, there is a political calculation happening here. And I think it's one of the most important things in this entire post that nobody is talking about. The real target of that Sunday morning rant wasn't James Talarico. It wasn't Jasmine Crockett. It was Gavin Newsom. Everything else was window dressing. Trump is looking ahead to 2028, and he sees a problem forming on the horizon. And his instinct, the same instinct he's had his whole career, is to define his most dangerous opponent before that opponent can define himself. That's what the NewsCom nickname is about. That's what total racist is about. That's what mental incapacity is about. He is trying to hang a label on Newsom right now in March of 2026, so that by the time the 2028 campaign begins in earnest, the frame is already built. And I'll be honest with you, Nuumi's Atlanta moment was a stumble. When you're speaking to a predominantly black audience and you reference your SAT scores trying to connect through your dyslexia, you have to be extraordinarily careful about how that lands. Nuumi called the backlash MAGA manufactured outrage. And there is truth in that, but there is also a lesson in it. When you're building a multiracial coalition, every word matters. And Gavin needs to learn from that moment. But here is the honest truth. There is a universe of difference between a clumsy attempt at connection and the deliberate, calculated cruelty of calling someone newscum and declaring them mentally incapacitated because they have dyslexia. Trump isn't critiquing Nuumi's Atlanta remarks out of genuine concern for the black community. He is exploiting a vulnerability to neutralize the man he fears most in 2028. And when Trump wrote, "I believe it takes him out of the race," that wasn't analysis. That was a prayer. So where does this all lead? Let me tell you what I think is coming based on what I've seen in 50 years of American politics. First, Trump's attack on James Talarico is going to backfire. Every time a sitting president punches down at a 36-year-old state representative running for Senate in Texas, he elevates that candidate. Talarico is now a national figure. He has a sermon going viral. He has the President of the United States validating him as a threat. And meanwhile, on the Republican side, John Cornyn and Ken Paxton are locked in a brutal runoff set for May 26th, a runoff that is going to drain Republican resources and expose every fracture in the Texas GOP. Democrats haven't had an opening like this in Texas in a generation. Second, the attacks on Nuumi will not take him out of the 2028 race. They will cement him in it. Every time Trump calls him newscom, Newsom's name recognition rises nationally and his fundraising climbs. Nuumi has already gained over 100,000 new contributors since his battles with this White House began. Trump is building Nuumi's brand for him, and I don't think he realizes it. Third, and this is the big picture, with approval ratings at record lows, with 28 state legislative seats lost, with a 2026 midterms approaching, this scattershot Sunday morning rant tells you something important about the state of this White House. A president who is winning does not attack 5 different Democrats in one post. A president who is confident does not mock disabilities and food choices. This is a White House that feels besieged. But let me offer a word of caution to my fellow Democrats. Momentum is not a governing majority. Special election wins are not a midterm wave. The question is not whether Democrats have energy. They clearly do. The question is whether they can convert that energy into durable power. That requires discipline, coalition building, and a message that reaches beyond the base. And that work is far from done. I want to close with something that I hope you'll carry with you after this conversation is over. The American people are not fools. They are watching. They see the special election results in Texas. They see the approval numbers. They see the tone of the president's public communications. And they are forming judgments quietly, privately, in the way Americans always do before they walk into a voting booth. Now, I'm not going to stand here and tell you Democrats have all the answers. We don't. Nuumi's Atlanta moment showed that even our best communicators can stumble. The party has internal tensions, generational, ideological, regional, that are real and unresolved. Building a coalition broad enough to govern a country this diverse is the hardest thing in democratic politics, and nobody should pretend otherwise. But here is the fundamental question before us, and I believe it is the most important question in American public life right now. Do we want a politics built on insults, slurs, and fear, or one built on problem-solving, accountability, and basic human respect? Because when a president of the United States calls people low IQ, newscom, and an insult to Jesus in a single Sunday morning post, that is not normal, and it should never become normal. The moment we accept it as normal is the moment we lose something essential about who we are as a country. The strength of American democracy has never been that it prevents bad behavior. Lord knows we've had plenty of it. The strength is that it eventually corrects. The pendulum swings, the people speak, the institutions hold. Not because they're perfect, but because enough good people refuse to let them fall. We've been through hard times before, times that felt darker than this. Times when the center seemed like it could not hold, and every single time the American people have found their way back, I believe they will